Tao for inviting Todor and organizing the seminar. And Todor, thanks for accepting the invitation. So it's a pleasure to have Todor Davchev. So Todor is from University of Edinburgh, where he is completing his PhD. He has spent time at Google and DeepMind and is excited about robot learning and especially how we can make robot learning be data efficient. And today he's going to talk to us about how we can use goal condition RL to learn skills quickly. With that, Todor, please take it away.
Thanks, Pulkit. Thanks for the nice introduction. So, hi everyone, I'm Todor, and today I'm going to talk about a fast skill acquisition with goal conditioned reinforcement learning, or utilizing behavioral priors and self-supervision. Now, before I proceed, I should encourage everyone to not hesitate and ask any questions should you have them throughout this presentation. Now, this talk is inspired by how humans learn. From an early age, we pick up a variety of skills and often find inspiration from our surroundings, like, for example, this scene from Rocky doing push-ups. Moreover, we can pick up skills that we can continuously improve on until we master them. And we also pick up skills such as grasping that we can quickly learn how to reuse throughout our daily lives in more than one setting. A core component of this skill acquisition process is the presence of a specific goal or a target that we aim to achieve, such as being strong or grasping this finger over here. In fact, we as humans broadly find learning for no reason, that is with no goal, quite difficult, leaving us often baffled without really picking up any knowledge whatsoever. So a natural question here would be, well, is it really fair for us to blindly train our agents without goal conditioning them as well? What if we conditioned our learning agents on goals in kind of a similar way to what we do in our daily lives with our own selves? Is this at all going to be useful, and is it going to help us speed up the skill learning process, specifically in the context of robot learning applications? Well, before we proceed, we should really think about what a skill is and what are its variations. Broadly, we can think about two different ways of varying skills. That is, we can vary the surrounding environment. A skill is applied in, summarized here as a perceptual variability, or varying the actual task settings, which I summarize here as a dynamical variability. Examples of the former include considering different scenes, the classical variability in light, through to introducing shadows or noise is commonly done by adversarial attacks, for example. On the other hand, dynamical perturbations capture variations in the geometry of an object being handled, introducing different masses and frictions, varying the speed of execution of or the actual goal of the task being solved, through to actually changing the robot configurations themselves. And in this talk, we focus specifically on the latter type of skill variability, and namely dynamical perturbations. In this setting, one might begin to wonder, well, how can we build learning-based systems that we can take all of this into account? We argue that we can counteract these factors of variation through utilizing structure, and specifically, we will consider the role of goal conditioning in these settings. Let us consider the following classical robotics loop, which I have labeled as robot acting loop here. In this loop, an agent interacts with its environment by using some sort of an end effector that applies some given actions that change the state of the environment. Now, these changes can be communicated back to the agent through utilizing some sensors, and the sense changes are processed and sent to a controller that takes into consideration some representation of these sensed information along with the relevant dynamics and decides a follow-up action that is determined through the agent's policy and is executed by the agent's end effector. Now, to be more specific, we will focus on the process of synthesizing policies today. Let us zoom into the red agent's block from the left-hand side, and there the gray box inside it is where the policies usually live, and this is where we will actually concentrate the rest of this talk today. A policy learning loop can be broadly illustrated with the following graphic. Here we collect some data from interacting with the environment. We then use it for synthesizing a policy, for example, by using some loss or a reward function. And then doing this results in learning some optimal or near optimal policy that can be used to interact with the environment again, and maybe collect more data for further refinement and so on. And specifically, we will see examples of how explicitly conditioning on our goals can improve each of these three components of RL and enable sample-efficient learning from sparse or learned rewards. In the remaining time, we are going to go over two projects that introduce different modes of goal-conditioned learning in the context of robotic skill acquisition. We will begin by looking into the role of goal conditioning in the context of policy learning. We will discuss how this enables restricting the search space, effectively reducing the training requirements. And specifically, we will dive into the concept of residual learning from demonstration and its role in context-rich manipulation, followed by utilizing hindsight goal selection through self-supervised data relabeling for long-horizon dexterous manipulation tasks. Then we will talk about reward learning and the inconvenient assumption of having access to the so-called environmental reward. We will show how learning goal-conditioned rewards can relax this assumption and can help synthesizing fast and useful policies from demonstrations. Specifically, we will talk about the role of learning to learn in the context of model-based inverse reinforcement learning for learning from visual demonstrations. And we will also discuss ways for improving the generality of these goal-conditioned reward functions through utilizing more structure. Now, if time permits, we can dig deeper into an additional direction that studies the role of representation learning in the context of structured learning through two tightly coupled projects for learning representations using modular architectures. Now, let us begin by revisiting our end objective, which is to enable robots to pick up skills similar to how humans do. That is, we would like to build robot learning solutions that can adapt to environmental changes and have mechanisms that can account for model imperfections. Here, our long-term vision is to enable sample-efficient, lifelong learning of manipulation-based skills that can scale to complex sequential settings as well. To get there, we begin by first looking into ways for synthesizing robust policies through sample-efficient learning that can generalize to new settings. Ideally, we would like to relax the need for model retraining in new environments and enable fast adaptation to unseen tasks. As a result, we introduce residual learning from demonstration in the context of context-rich manipulation. In this work, we focus specifically on the skill of insertion. We consider three different in complexity insertion tasks to evaluate our work on. We look into a peg insertion task, which is mostly dependent on the position of the robot's end effector due to the round hole the peg is inserted in. A gear insertion task, which requires precise orientation as well as a stronger push in downward direction due to the tighter fit in the gear square hole. And finally, LAN cable insertion, which requires both precise position and orientation due to its shape, as well as very refined force control, for too much force could break the plastic tip.
So Todor, maybe a quick question. Are we assuming that the models are known of these objects, or they are assumed to be unknown?
They are assumed to be unknown. This is a model-free solution.
Okay.
All right, so to solve this, we propose to work with demonstrations. So we propose to solve these by relying on learning from demonstration paradigm, where a robot hand is teleoperated by an expert demonstrator, as you can see in this GIF here. We used DMPs or dynamic movement primitives to extract a policy using a single demonstration, which we then deploy to different configurations. So if you think about it as a framework for context-rich insertion, we can really implement these basic DMP as follows. We will have some base policy that runs at some fixed frequency, such as 100 Hertz, that results in a trajectory from T0 to Tn depicted down below. Here, a translational DMP can be extracted from some given demonstrations collected through teleoperating a robot. And then for each time step, the DMP will produce an action. Now, in this work, we introduce an additional structure over the utilized actions where we can operate the higher level DMP policy in Cartesian space and rely on some analytical controller, such as an impedance controller, to produce the final action that gets applied to the physical world. The outcome is what we call rote imitation that comes with some generalization properties. However, it cannot cope with slight environmental perturbations and task changes. For example, consider this second GIF where we perturb the start position of the robot by just a little bit. You will see that the policy will fail to solve the task. There you go. Therefore, we can improve our framework by introducing an additional base policy that handles specifically orientations. Now, this has previously been done in the literature, and we reference this in the lower left corner of this slide. So scaling these, the resulted solution performs a little bit better, as you can see on the left-hand side's GIF, but it's not ideal as it can still get stuck and fails to generalize too well, as you can see on the right-hand side. To overcome this, we introduce a feedback adaptive term that adapts the executed motion online. To this end, we propose the following residual learning formulation. We define a concurrent policy which learns how to adapt our base policy by using the base action and the actual state of the world. We propose to build such a residual policy by relying on modern, goal-conditioned, model-free reinforcement learning that can act directly on the end effector's twist. Note that the concurrent nature of our proposed solution allows for running both policies at different frequencies, where while the base policy runs at 100 Hertz, the RL-based residual policy is run at 10 Hertz and is also trained using a sparse reward. Finally, both the residual action and the base action are passed to the impedance controller. We refer to this framework as residual learning from demonstration, or RLFD for short. However, DMPs are naturally a member of the residual policy family. Due to the adaptive nonlinear terms you can see in this equation over here. Two examples of these are F omega and CT. And therefore, a residual term can be applied to different parts of the DMP formulation, and so it's not really clear how precisely training an RL adaptive component should be done. For example, consider the following simple Archimedean spiral executed using a DMP. And shown in purple on this slide. We can add Gaussian exploration noise eta to different components of the DMP formulation, which can lead to very different behaviors. For example, we can add exploration noise in coupling term space C, or a forcing term space F, or we can directly apply it in task space outside the DMP modulation. Now, generally, contact-rich manipulation can benefit from local exploration along a nominal trajectory. Well, you can think of it as the jiggling motion we all do when trying to plug our charger into a socket. Adapting in task space depicted in green in this figure gives us precisely this sort of a behavioral prior. Therefore, we propose a residual learning from demonstration framework expressed in task space that acts on the full pose of the robot's end effector. For the interest of time, I'd encourage you to go over the paper and find out further details of how this happens precisely. Alternatively, I'd be happy to go over it at the end if time permits. Let us consider the following simulated environment that will help us highlight the effect of adapting directly in task space. As an experiment, we can compare applying exploration noise during training to different parts of the DMP formulation as we introduced earlier. Here, we color code each type of exploration used by prior work that employs RL according to the 4 GIFs shown below. Now, adapting directly in task space achieves overall far better accuracy across all tasks, but it's also far more sample efficient. Training RLFD required 700 episodes, which is the equivalent of 2 hours of training. Furthermore, RLFD was also able to learn with sparse rewards, with just a single sparse reward. This is particularly appealing in practice since defining a useful reward for learning contact-rich manipulation skills is non-trivial and can be quite consuming as well. Note that none of the baselines was able to learn using a sparse reward, and in order to get them to train, we employed the distance-based reward function originally used in the reference papers. The reported results in the previous slide are great, but it's still not clear if it's relatively safe for us to apply RLFD to a physical system. So let's measure how gentle to the joint RLFD really is. In this slide, we will report the average force experienced on all joints during insertion. This means that we want to see as little force experienced as possible, and therefore we'll have a slightly more gentle solution. And actually, it turns out that RLFD that is shown in green is relatively as gentle as a DMP execution, which is shown in red here. This is in contrast to the alternative strong baselines, which applied a lot more force. All of the baselines use reinforcement learning too. So basically, it seems like we can proceed to testing RLFD on a physical system, knowing that we are probably less likely to break the robot compared to other RL solutions.
So Todor, just to be clear, so when you are training this residual policy, are you getting, more demonstrations from varying initial positions, or are you generating initial positions automatically?
That's an awesome question. It's automatic. So we use a single demonstration to extract a policy, and then we vary the starting configuration by just sampling from just a uniform distribution with up to 3 centimeters away on all axes from the starting configuration, basically.
I see. But then are you doing dagger style, supervision, where if you start from a different initial position, then you provide supervision for it?
It sort of, but not exactly. So at the halfway through insertion, through the executing the policy, we just turn on the residual term, and the residual term decides on whether or not to adapt at any point on its own, effectively.
But to learn the residual adaptation policy, you will need some supervision, right? So
it's just the sparse reward. So
I
actually, this is a very good question. It depends on what the model-free algorithm is, really. So in our physical experiments, we use PPO, but PPO is very sample inefficient. So to actually get it to train, we had to introduce this manual curriculum. We didn't need to do that for SAC, however.
So by manual curriculum, you mean like increasing the radius of sampling initial positions?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So if I understand, you have a demonstration in which you try to insert, and then you have a curriculum which increases the starting positions of the robotic hand.
Yeah.
And then the adaptation policy is trained with the reward function.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So can I? Okay, makes sense. Okay.
Cool. Actually, a curious fact here was that we didn't expect DMPs to work at all, but they turned out to be fairly robust. So depending on how much you vary the demonstration, we can talk about it later, but if you start within 3 millimeters away, they're super robust. So you can achieve actually pretty good accuracy with these. But yeah, let's move on. So just we proceed our evaluation with the 3 tasks. And just to recap them, we consider peg insertion, gear insertion, and LAN cable insertion, or RJ45. It's just a synonym term. So we compared our approach against a number of strong baselines, including the standard residual learning strategy from previous literature, which applies translation corrections only. Now, our results indicate that RLFD, which acts on the full pose of the robot and uses a goal-conditioned RL for a residual policy, is far better than all considered alternative baselines. And as we just mentioned, we used a curriculum to get PPO to work. So a key benefit of decoupling the base policy and the goal-conditioned residual one in our specific solution is the ability of transferring the residual component to new tasks within using only a few update steps. And this happens thanks to the jiggling exploration behavior, which we apply directly in task space that we just discussed. So to see this, let's consider training a policy on a source task, which is going to be either a gear or an RJ45, and then transferring it to an associated target task, which is the other way around, either RJ45 or gear. And to measure performance, we can use the accuracy of solving a target task. Now, we use the one demonstration for extracting a base policy, as we have been doing so far. And normally in standard learning settings, we will directly train on the target task we want to test on, right? So that is, we will train on the gear task if we wanted to test performance on the gear task, or train on the RJ45 if you care about performance on RJ45. And if we look at this table here, the first 2 rows show that this approach performs far better than training on a source task, which means the opposite task. So if we trained on gear and then tested on RJ45, it will just perform worse, as we'd expect. However, thanks to our behavioral power of jiggling, we can actually transfer the residual policy trained on a source task to a target one using 3 update steps only, or 60 episodes. Now, this means that we can reduce the policy acquisition time to 15 minutes of training, including resets, as opposed to the standard full training on a target task, which takes around 2 hours. And our results show that transferring a policy achieves near optimal results, which which is far better than training from scratch directly on the target task for 15 minutes only. Effectively, we can successfully transfer our residual policy across both tasks, requiring about 8 times less training. So in summary, we have so far proposed a framework for residual learning from demonstration that successfully employs DMPs and goal conditioned RL. We showed its capacity to adapt to world changes, effectively achieving efficient and online-driven solution, adapt to model imperfections while maintaining sample efficient and producing a less forceful solution as well than alternative schemes. And furthermore, we showed its capacity to transfer residual policies across different tasks that have different geometries, frictions, and masses. And finally, we have this bonus give here that shows how aggressively pushing the robot does not really prevent it from successfully inserting the peg thanks to the employed impedance controller. More information can be found at our paper that is linked below. So the framework we discussed so far proved to be quite useful for adapting DMPs for context-rich manipulation. However, the considered horizon of all tasks was fairly standard and comprised of a single skill, that of a fixed in-place insertion. Instead, we would like to be able to handle long horizon complex sequential tasks that are comprised of multiple chained together skills, such as reaching, grasping, insertion, and so on. This will effectively allow us to scale to even harder tasks. Next, we look into the second component of robot learning loop, which deals with data handling. We will consider a novel way for performing task-constrained hindsight data relabeling for training successful and efficient policies. Effectively, we employ a set of self-supervised learning strategies and achieve a demonstration and training efficient solution. Solving complex sequential tasks with sparse rewards can be hard, especially in continuous control settings like the ones we consider in this work. A complex sequential task consists of a sequence of narrow passage phases that an agent needs to go through in order to complete the task. One example of this is having to reach towards a cable, grasp it, and do something with it, such as lift it or align it, or maybe even insert it. The complexity of these tasks can be further increased by working with large continuous action spaces, like, for example, in dual arm control. And here, an agent needs to operate 2 robotic arms, each of which needs to go through its own narrow passage phases to complete the task, such as insertion. Now, in this work, we address the problem of solving complex sequential tasks with sparse rewards in a similar to this story example setting. In fact, the hardest problem we solve is a bimanual insertion task where an agent has to insert a 3.5 millimeter jack attached to a dangling cable into its respective socket that is attached to another dangling cable, and we used 2 Panda Franca arms. The complexity of the considered problem is defined by the number of narrow passage phases an agent goes through, the reduced access to positive signal due to the long horizon nature of these problems, the relatively large state space, and the necessity of extra large sample requirements that are typically needed to solve tasks of this nature in a model-free way. In practice, those can lead to hardware wear and tear and therefore are undesirable. So in summary, we deal with an interesting exploration challenge and propose a framework for solving it. Consider the following training scenario. Given some start configuration illustrated as a green dot here and a desired target goal location represented as an orange dot, an agent rolls out some current policy and reaches a state, producing a trajectory that is shown with a dashed line. Now, the environmental reward assigns a 0 to all intermediate states and either a 1 to the final state in case that the rollout reaches the target goal, or 0 otherwise, as is the case in this slide. This in nature is the same as the sparse reward we saw in the previous project. The rollout effectively results in a sequence of goal condition transitions, which are stored in a replay buffer similar to what is typically done in classic off-policy RL. But that's not enough. If we really wanted to solve long horizon tasks from sparse rewards, we need to do something more because the ratio of positive to negative transitions in this specific set of examples is going to be extremely small. So to overcome this, we propose to utilize demonstrations through the so-called retroactive goal selection which is done in a self-supervised manner. Now, although this sounds complicated, it simply means that after the agent rolls out a trajectory, for each time step t along this trajectory, we create a new state action tuple by choosing a new goal located somewhere along the target trajectories from the provided demonstrations. And this effectively creates an additional pair to store in our replay buffer, which is essentially increasing of the data that we learn from. The new state action tuple is re-evaluated or relabeled using a goal conditioned reward, illustrated as a bold R here. So all of this is good, but our states are usually quite high dimensional and not some silly dashed lines, and in fact can become quite complicated. However, learning from raw states is rather impractical in high D spaces, so we have a bit of a problem. If we really wanted to scale our goal condition policies to complex sequential tasks and still be able to train them using sparse rewards, we have to think a little bit more. One big problem is that using raw states makes it quite hard to define a goal conditioned reward. This is because we don't really know how to compare our time steps to randomly selected goals from our demonstrations. For example, the reward for grasping a cable is very different than the reward for measuring distance between two already grasped cable tips, right? So in principle, we can solve this by defining a bunch of different rewards, but then how do we even know what reward to choose for some randomly sampled goal from some random demonstration? We can also no longer use the environmental reward here because the intermediate states are not necessarily measurable in the same way as the final state of insertion. The state dimensionality is quite complicated, as we just mentioned, so what do we really do? Well, as you probably are thinking this already, we propose to solve this by just using an encoder, psi, which can encode states to low dimensional latent spaces, but can explicitly encode the notion of progress. And this way we can know how far in the task a given state is with respect to any target goal. We can do this by utilizing both engineered and learned time consistent representations. While this is very important in principle, discussing representation learning techniques goes beyond the scope of this talk, but briefly, we use the temporal cycle consistency learning to obtain temporally consistent representations. However, in the interest of time, I'd leave this out for the end of the talk.
So Todor, just so I am following. So
Yeah.
you want to assign any of the goals in the orange, any of the states in the orange trajectory as a goal, right? So you're doing hindsight relabeling.
Exactly, yeah.
And the problem is you cannot measure distance in the raw state space. So we are learning a representation to measure distance.
Exactly, yes.
And then the reward would be sparse, right? It would be, are you close enough in the representation space?
Yeah, and defining what sparse is, it really affects training as well. But yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay.
All right, so in light of this description, we propose the following framework for hindsight goal selection for demo-driven reinforcement learning, or just HINDRO for short. Now, given the initial start configuration and a desired target goal location, we query a goal condition policy pi that takes in as input an encoded state and a goal representation. We propose to use a temporally consistent encoder, which is an encoder that preserves the notion of progress across different episodes, regardless of their length. We show that these encoders are particularly suitable to be used with our distance-based reward function and overall pipeline. Querying the policy pi produces actions that advance the state of the agent, resulting in an agent rollout. In cases where the episode is successful, we store its final state in the goal database, which we use to sample target goal states during training. We refer to this as the online goal selection stage. We then, once we're done with this, we take the entire trajectory and encode it, producing, basically encode it using our temporally consistent encoder and enter the hindsight goal selection state. Now, in practice, this stage can utilize different strategies, such as the commonly used hindsight experience replay or alternative demonstration-driven strategies like the ones proposed in this work. Although mixing these strategies is possible in practice too, we will only focus on treating them separately for the interest of time. The resulted tuples are then being stored in a replay buffer. And this overall framework results in the pipeline used for training HINDRO. Again, more details, including the proposed training losses, can be found in the paper. Let us consider the following simulated environment that will help us highlight the effect of hinge role on long horizon dexterous manipulation tasks. Here we can define a few different in complexity tasks whose details we will omit for the interest of time again, but they're essentially different sequences of solving the entire insertion task, including the full bimanual insertion. In addition, in the next few slides, we will use an encoder from engineered features, although in this work, we considered learned features too. We compared against a number of baselines where we used the same encoded states as input to all methods. We show that among all solutions, only hinge role was able to consistently solve all long horizon problems, achieving on average 90% success rate. We achieved this using at maximum 3,000 episodes. Next, we studied the ability of hinge role to perform on a few shot settings. Here, we report the performance of the hardest task only, which is the full insertion, but provide a complete analysis against all tasks in the paper. Our results show that hinge role consistently works better than all baselines and is far less dependent on the number of demonstrations used. We observed that we need around 50 demonstrations to get a fairly accurate full bimanual insertion solution. So in summary, we propose a strategy for hindsight goal selection using demonstrations and distance-based goal conditioned rewards, and propose an overall framework for task-constrained goal conditioned reinforcement learning. We show that it can successfully solve long horizon dexterous manipulation tasks, and that it works consistently and sample efficiently in challenging few shot settings. Our solution was also demonstrated to be robust towards using both engineered and learn time consistent representations, but this, along with a bunch of different ablations, can be found in the paper linked below.
So maybe a quick question, right? So if we were to transfer this on a real robot, would the main problem be that the state of the wire is hard to measure, or do you, foresee other problems?
The biggest problem, the biggest kind of foreseeable problem is the actual state space. So in engineering this state space, and also to train the encoder, we assumed access to some of the states of the cable. So for example, we knew if the cable was grasped or not. We had an actual distance from the gripper tips to the graspable point of the cable. And we also knew if we have successfully inserted or not. So this would be, I think, at least the most easily foreseeable challenge if you were to transfer this on a physical robot. How do you estimate these states, essentially?
But this you would need at training time, right? Not at deployment, I presume.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's true.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can, yeah. So maybe something like sim-to-rail could be possible, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. All right, so let's quickly recap. So far, we saw that we can optionally have some base policy, for example, expressed using a GMP, and the goal-conditioned model-free reinforcement learning policy that can either adapt the DMP or be tasked with a harder, long-horizon, complex sequential task. We saw that we can take the output of those policies and pass it to some analytical controller that will execute some trajectory expressed as a dashed line again. We also discussed how goal-conditioned RL agents learn, that is by storing the state action goal tuples into a replay buffer. We also saw that we can utilize demonstrations to improve the exploration challenge for more complex tasks. And we did this by relabeling each time step from our trajectory using a new goal sampled from the demonstration database. We saw that this improves the ratio of positive to negative examples, and that helped with training. So we differentiated between two separate rewards as well. An environmental reward, which in all cases was a sparse 0-1 reward that can tell if we have inserted or not. We also pointed out a second goal-conditioned reward function that measures the Euclidean distance between some current state and a newly sampled goal. All of this enabled us to solve efficiently complex in nature tasks quite accurately and robustly. All of that is great, but given that we saw that goal-conditioned RL can be quite useful, we can achieve a lot of cool stuff, but in all cases, we assumed somewhat simplistic rewards. which can negatively impact training. For example, in the presence of visual demonstrations or in the context of sensor fusion, which is often useful in contact group settings. So ideally, we would like to employ informative rewards without really relying on manual engineering. In the remaining time, we show how utilizing approaches from the learning to learn literature can allow us to learn goal-conditioned rewards. We will look into a model-based inverse reinforcement learning solution that extracts goal-conditioned rewards from visual demonstrations. We will also discuss how we can scale this to learning time-invariant rewards that enable synthesizing policies at different speeds of execution and can learn from temporally misaligned demonstrations too. In summary, we will see how employing meta-learning and model-based control can further improve generalization and training requirements. Let's briefly recap how IRL works. Assume that we have a number of aligned demonstrations illustrated with their velocity profiles in this slide. We use them to extract a reward function, which in turn is used to synthesize a policy that is then used to produce actions. And those actions result in some trajectory that runs at some fixed speed and is depicted in dark red here. Now, this trajectory is compared to the initially used demonstrations shown in blue and are used to adapt the obtained reward. And this nested loop of obtaining a reward, synthesizing a policy, and doing this over and over again is referred to as inverse reinforcement learning. With this in mind, we want to learn manipulation from visual demonstrations. Our pipeline for solving this problem has two stages. One, learn the cost function from the visual demonstration. And two, reproduce the demonstrated behavior by optimizing actions with respect to the learned cost. We first examine the second part of this pipeline, and that is the visual MPC framework. This pipeline stitches together several components. These include a key point detector that detects pixel positions roughly corresponding to the object in the initial image, a dynamics model that predicts the key points and joint state at the next time step, and finally, the action optimization step. Once a trajectory of key points and joint configurations has been predicted from the initial state, it is compared to the goal key points using the learned cost function. Minimizing this cost function with respect to actions via gradient descent gives us the optimal set of actions that move the object to its goal position. We next provide an overview of learning the cost function itself. Our framework for learning the cost function builds upon gradient-based bi-level optimization. Here, the inner loop of this framework optimizes the action trajectory using the current cost function parameters, effectively synthesizing a policy, while the outer loop updates the cost function parameters psi. So far, this is the same as the classic RL loop we recapped moments ago. The outer step extracts a reward or a cost, and the inner one uses it to synthesize a policy. However, in comparison to other IRL algorithms, our outer loop updates costs parameters by differentiating through the inner loop. This gradient-based connection between the inner and outer loops leads to a more stable and effective optimization. We compare results on learning from visual demonstrations on different goal-conditioned cost function parameterizations. These include the weighted cost, where the learnable parameters are weights corresponding to each dimension of the error between predicted and goal key points. The time-dependent cost, which extends the weighted cost by also learning weights corresponding to each time step of the trajectory. And finally, the RBF weighted cost, that, like the time-dependent cost, learns weights per time step of the trajectory, but uses significantly less parameters to do so. More details, including the actual structure of the RBF cost, can be found in our paper. And finally, we compare these to a baseline cost that measures the Euclidean distance between the predicted trajectory and the goal key points. And note that this default cost is the same as the goal condition reward we used in Hydro. So we evaluate our methods on a placing task. Our demonstration for the task consists of a video in which a user moves the object first horizontally and then vertically to place it on a shelf. We evaluate all of our learned cost parameterizations and the default cost baseline on two different test cases with two different initial robot configurations. The best performing cost parameterization for test case 1 is the RBF cost, with the time-dependent cost being a close contender. We note that the weighted cost is unable to place the object fully on the shelf, indicating that the time dependency component in the learning cost plays some role in ensuring generalization. The default cost results in the object somewhat colliding with the edge of the shelf in an attempt to take the shortest path to the goal. This is in contrast to the learned cost, which presumably takes cues from the demonstration. All the learned costs perform similarly and much better than the default cost for test case 2. We show a side-by-side comparison of the trajectory optimized using the time-dependent and the default cost to illustrate this difference. So in summary, we propose a gradient-based inverse reinforcement learning solution that learns cost functions from visual human demonstrations. We learn a compact key point-based image representation and train a visual dynamics in that latent space. We then use the key point trajectories extracted from user demonstrations and our learned dynamics model to learn different cost functions that are using our gradient-based inverse reinforcement learning algorithm. Finally, we show that RBF weighted costs perform best in the context of the considered tasks. More details can be found in our paper linked below. So far, we saw a state-of-the-art model-based inverse reinforcement learning solution that can learn from visual demonstrations. However, in that project, we assumed access to somewhat aligned demonstrations and deployment at a fixed speed of execution. This is somewhat impractical in the context of robotics, and building time-invariant solutions is of crucial importance, for example, in collaborative settings or for achieving more careful and therefore slower control. So ideally, we would like to have a formulation that allows us to, one, relax the temporal alignment requirements for learning from demonstration and therefore enable learning from different misaligned demonstrations. And two, vary the length of execution by learning time-invariant costs, which can allow us to deploy rewards that can synthesize policies which run at different speeds. We evaluate the following project in simulation only. Specifically, we consider two types of tasks: object placement, similar to the last few slides, and a pegging hole, similar to the first two papers we discussed earlier. Let's define the reward we will learn as a function denoted as a capital letter C, which is parameterized by phi, and which takes in as input some produced trajectory tau hat and a single desired goal location G. Actually, let's make this a little bit more structured. Here, the term in small brackets can be interpreted as a feature of the input trajectory where we calculate the square distance of each time step from our trajectory to the final goal, while phi is some learnable parameterization we multiply the features by. It is namely these parameters phi that we meta-learn. In the context of the previous project, a basic structured cost can be defined using an RBF network. A core assumption in this formulation is that we used linearly spaced in time fixed number of kernels in the previous project that had fixed locations along the exact length of the provided trajectories. Now, in practice, this ensures that a given center mu will influence a specific region of a chosen trajectory. We can vary the width of those radial basis functions by adjusting the width b, but the shown formulation cannot shift the center's mu in time. This means that a smaller in length trajectory and therefore a faster execution will now require the RBF centers to correspond to different parts of the execution, as they will not shift in time, but instead will stay the same relative to the given demonstration. And to this end, we propose to use time invariant costs. Let's consider the same structured cost function from the previous slide. We propose to use an additional input of a temporal term lambda, similar to what is used for DMPs that can effectively shift these centers in time. This will enable all centers to remain in the same region spatially, allowing for a weighted representation that can adjust to different speeds of execution. We refer to this approach as structured time invariant costs. Similarly, we can define an unstructured time invariant cost by just defining the cost as an MLP that takes in as input the same term lambda. In practice, lambda we define lambda as a temporal term that is proportional to the desired speed of execution given some base speed extracted from the initial demonstrations. To illustrate the utility of this approach, we trained using misaligned demonstrations and varied tasks by both the goal locations and the speeds of execution. We compared against strong baselines, including the RBF meta-learned solution from a few slides ago, and overall, we saw that our proposed solutions worked best. Now, here are some examples of solving two tasks with different speeds as well. So in summary, we proposed the temporal scaling mechanism for learning both time-invariant structured and unstructured reward functions. We enabled learning from temporally misaligned demonstrations that can scale to different speeds and provide an extensive comparison of the generalization abilities of both structured and unstructured reward functions. More details can be found in our paper linked below. So in summary, in this presentation, we saw a few different examples of using goal conditioning in the context of RL. Specifically, we discussed two types of goal conditioned learning, namely goal conditioned policy learning and goal conditioned reward learning. We looked at a framework for context-rich insertion that makes use of a residual policy learning for transfer across different tasks. And we saw how goal-conditioned RL can enable task-constrained, self-supervised ways for hindsight relabeling. Now, in terms of reward learning, we discussed how we can enable learning from visual demonstrations and how we can extract time-invariant rewards. And finally, a common thread among all approaches is the concept of representation learning, where representations can enable both fast policy learning, but also allow for extracting more useful goal-conditioned rewards. Next, we briefly touch on a few potentially exciting directions of research. And broadly, I find the niche challenge quite exciting. And so the examples here are in this context, but regardless, the ideas scale beyond this particular challenge. And one potential direction is in the context of learning from demonstration. For example, learning temporally consistent latent representation from vision that takes into account additional sensory information like force signals can allow us to learn more informed imitation policies. One potential extension could be to utilize our meta inverse reinforcement learning formulation in the context of more general LFD for context-rich insertion. A second exciting direction of research is to scale our goal condition policy formulations to multitask settings. For example, we can employ learning to learn in the context of extracting more powerful task condition policies. In addition, we can potentially maintain multiple demonstration data sets and perhaps multiple goal condition rewards, and inferring which data set and reward to use on the spot seems like a feasible way forward. Now, as a conclusion, I'd like to show you this robot we call the insertion monster that has multiple different types of sockets that it needs to learn how to insert in. Now, although it's just still a concept, I'd be very keen to see in action this monster one day. And with this, I would like to reiterate our end objective one more time. We would like to enable robots to pick up skills similar to how humans do. And a long-term vision is to enable sample-efficient, lifelong learning of manipulation-based skills that can scale to complex sequential settings. A recent problem that I'm curious about for the near future is the role of goal-conditioned reinforcement learning in the context of acquiring context-rich manipulation skills, such as grasping or insertion of different types of objects in the context of multitask learning, the utilization of vision and fusing it with force sensing for more informed goal-conditioned policy learning and imitation, as well as learning more informed goal-conditioned reward functions, for example, as advertised in the NIST challenge. With this, I'm generally excited about projects combining machine learning, reinforcement learning, deep learning for robotics, including working on algorithms, simulations, actual robot experimentation, and the relevant software and hardware environments. Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks a lot, Todor, for the talk and all the cool demos throughout. So we have a time for a few questions. No questions for Todor?
Maybe one small question from my end. So basically, towards the end, you talked about, using contrastive learning to maybe learn some kind of a similar feature uh, or some kind of a common feature for both, like vision as well as touch. So I just wanted to ask questions on that. GelSight already provides you with vision. So I'm just like wondering, like, how will, like, since it's already vision, doesn't it like, so one simple approach one can take is to basically, put image and like the GelSight side by side and use that as, like your input. The other question is, oftentimes when, a robot is touching some object, you don't see, like the visual area where it's touching, or, like sometimes like the visual area is occluded and that's why you need touch. So how do you, like, kind of, like try to like get around that issue? Because like sometimes like the vision might be not be available, but like the touch sensor might be available for that particular object.
That's an awesome question. Well, I don't have the answer, but I have this kind of a hypothesis. So when we worked on the Hinjo project, we had this TCC based representation, which was very good in kind of detecting the notion of progress, but it would fail at these sort of contexts where you're grasping or you're inserting. And the reason for it was that there'll be a bunch of different kind of latent points that are situated at the same location. And it was very difficult to tell what's happening. So using force could be kind of added in this context to be able to tell, yes, you have successfully completed this sort of a segment of your a sequence, or no, you haven't. Yeah, for example.
I see. So in that case, I can see, like force as being a good, like, or force as being an important signal for reward for learning reward function. So, okay, that's it. Yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks for the question. That was awesome.
So Todor, I mean, can you give a little bit more insight into how do you do time invariant learning, right? So you showed this, graphics where you were able to align the time points.
Yeah. So maybe I should start by just briefly recapping how TCC works. I think I have a slide on that. It's essentially, oh boy, quite far away. There you go. So the way TCC works is you would just take 2 episodes and you will try to encode them in this latent space. So the idea is that you take a given time step and you try to find the nearest neighbor in the latent space of the other video. And then you take this kind of a point in the other video and you try to find the nearest neighbor on video 1. And if these 2 match, then you have cycle consistency. If you don't, then you have an error signal. So you're trying to minimize the distance between projecting to the nearest neighbor on video 1 to the nearest neighbor of video 2, and vice versa. And by doing this, this kind of gives you this notion of progress that will be able to take a given time step and project it into this latent space that is somewhat aligned to the latent space of the demonstration that you have seen.
So is this what allows you to not have time-aligned demonstrations? That you can pretty much pick up on 2 points in the demonstration I guess 2 states in the demonstration which are not time-aligned?
Yeah, that was sufficient to get this, but there were some problems associated with the clustering of many data points around the contact-rich parts of the trajectory, and TCC failed for these. So the way we dealt with it is the way we defined the sparsity of the, so I think I have a slide on this too. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so essentially you end up having a trajectory like this. These are, after we have trained TCC, this is 100 demonstrations that have never been seen before, and you can see that they're somewhat aligned according to the progress. So then we would use a latent embedding of a state S or Z here, and the goals latent encoding as well. And we use the L2 distance between them. So if you fall below the threshold epsilon, you are said to have achieved the task. It's a little bit of a hack. If you are above it, then you haven't solved it. And then the way you define this threshold is from demonstrations. And you can take a trajectory of demonstrations and you can take the distance between two consecutive time steps, and the maximum distance could be your epsilon, but you can also take the distance between time step at time step t and the one at time step t plus n, and then this could be your epsilon threshold. So varying this n is how we handled the problem here, but this is quite a bit of a hack, so it's a little bit shaky.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Any other quick questions from anyone? No. So I think, Todor, we are at the hour. So, thanks a lot once again for the talk. It was a pleasure having you. And I guess you have your one-on-one meeting schedule, right?